Today, we're at Raglan Castle, home of the Blue Knight of Gwent. It's one of the most beautiful castles in southern Wales. It's not an early Norman castle, although there is some suggestion that there may have been a Norman castle here. Any sign of it is long eradicated. All that archaeologists could find was possible remains of a bailey ditch. This is a Middle Ages castle. The modern castle dates from the 15th and early 17th century, when the successive ruling families of the Huberts and Somersets lived here. It's complicated. It's a real rabbit warren of a castle. There's room after room after room, and corridors and staircases, and considering that half of it at least is missing because there's no floors in much of it, it really was a substantial property. And you have to remember that this sat in an ornamental landscape with a lake, a Tudor manor house for a summer house by that lake, and terraces of water gardens and gardens. So it really must have been a magnificent scene. As we approach here, it is a defensive castle, but this is more decorative than defensive these days. And the keep is unusually to the side. You see there's an octagonal keep within that moat. But to get to it, you have to enter the main castle, and then you come back on yourself. We're going to go through the main gate and into the castle itself, and we'll get to the keep at the end, because you can see here it was defensive. It did have a substantial defence, and it did actually take part in the English Civil War, which is when it was put in this state. It's sad how many castles in England, Corfe Castle's the one that particularly comes to mind, that were perfectly good, usable, still lived in castles, but were deliberately destroyed by Parliament at the end of the English Civil War. Castle Raglan was built in the middle of a deer park, so it's not a traditional castle in the sense of commanding a hill. It is on a bit of a rise, but really it was a home, a very elaborate, impressive home, in the form of a medieval castle, a grand manor house. Though looking at the scale of it and the fortification, it's hard to think of it as a home. In the early 15th century, Sir William ap Thomas lived here, and he was from a minor Welsh family, and he rose through the ranks of politics, and he did very well for himself from local offices that he held. And it gave him the money to begin this castle, and then he married a wealthy heiress, Gwaldus, and then another heiress proved to bring a lot of money. By 1432, Sir William purchased the manor of Raglan. It was just a manor. It wasn't there's no duke, there's no earl, there's no marquis. And having bought it, he started building basic form and shape of the castle. And he had permission to castellate, that's put the little castellations that you draw as a child if you drew a castle. You actually need permission from the king to do that. Well, you certainly did through till about the Victorian era. And he built this great tower at the south gate. And at that point he stopped. He got himself a large manor house. It was very impressive. But his son continued, and he dropped the Welsh version of the name Sir Ap Thomas and started calling himself William Herbert, a much more Norman English name. He supported the House of York during the War of the Roses, fought in the 100 Years' War in France, made yet more fortune from the Gascon wine trade. and continued the association with Welsh politics. So he was described as a national deliverer in a poem. By 1460, William used his wealth to remodel Raglan on a much grander scale, with additions like this hall. Over 2 centuries, the two families had substantial wealth, and they flaunted it. They showed it off with Raglan. They enlarged it, they added towers, they added walls, they added apartments high up in the towers, fireplaces, chimneys. They modernised the structure. And all of this is about 10 miles from Cardiff, from Newport really, which was not really the significant place it is today. But you can see this fireplace here. This would have been for cooking, a fireplace this size for cooking. Really not a minor fireplace. On the right there they had contraption for evenly cooking fish. One of the lords was quite keen on himself as an inventor. All the while as this was being built and enlarged, parks were being built around it. There were 2 deer parks, Home Park and Red Deer Park. And they were built so that they could be viewed from the castle. The wilderness and mountains rising up in the distance with deer parks flowing across the valley. But this wasn't enough for them. As the Somersets became more and more wealthy, they added extensive orchards and fish ponds around the castle. And even that wasn't enough. In 1469, Herbert was executed as a Yorkist supporter, and his daughter was allowed to keep the property, and she married Sir Charles Somerset, passing the family into the Somerset family line. And he was again politically successful, very wealthy, and was made the Earl of Worcester. Henry VIII favoured him and allowed him to regain stone from Tintern Abbey. If you've seen our video on Tintern Abbey, it's such a substantial abbey with the church rising high into the sky, but the surrounding buildings, there's a lot of stone missing, and quite a lot of that stone made its way to Raglan and was used to make the expansions to Raglan Castle. As you look up, you can see the different shapes of window, and you see a more structured manner. And really was taking over from the Norman archers, moving more towards a perpendicular style. And this castle evolved substantially over that 200 years. In the fabric, you can actually see which are the older and younger portions of the castle. The more ruined section over there is actually the younger section with the more pointy arched windows of the perpendicular style. They were built after the earlier sections. Come down here, there's a passageway between the sections of the castle and a very large storage area. It's quite impressive. I'm probably featuring half of the video, so showing half of the rooms, because it is a very complicated maze of rooms. Here we're underneath the arched bridge to the keep. Must have been a very substantial household here, and you feel the wealth, even though the decoration is gone, the windows are gone, a lot of the walls. The sheer scale of this, and as you look down over the valley, you know that all the way down that valley was a dam, a lake, deer park, fish ponds, all landscaped for the ideal impression of a successful Tudor lord. This was no minor lord. This was a sign, a stamp of success, of wealth, of opulence. And it would have been decorated that way as well, with tapestries which were relieved of the French during the 100 Years' War. You have to imagine those walls plastered and decorated, covered in elaborate decoration. High up here on the second floor were the apartments for his family. And it was quite a big family, so there was about 5 different large apartments for members of the family, as well as housing for servants and storage and an area for celebration and showing off. You don't build a pleasure palace like this to visit occasionally. You build it to live in and for people to come and be impressed by your extreme wealth. The castle was so large and complicated that Edward Somerset made very minor improvements in the 17th century. Really, he focused on the exterior, expanding and developing these gardens, building the moat walk around the Great Tower. So we'll go around that in a little while. There's the Great Tower, which I've been referring to as a keep. Although it's not technically a keep, it effectively architecturally is talking as though it is. It's styled that way as a keep, even if it's in the wrong place. It's on the outside. And there was a very large library there as well. And we're going to head up these stairs. The only piece of the wall which you can actually go up to is a very small stub of the wall. But you can get up there and you have a wonderful view over Raglan. And you can make out the scale of it from up there. It's a typically winding stone staircase. Always feels like I'm in a castle if I walk around a spiral staircase like this. Luckily, metal handrails being added because it is pretty steep. And there's also a little resting place part way up. At the top here, hopefully I put the camera down, you can see the castle itself. And surely with the pleasure gardens surrounding the castle, there must have been a viewpoint for visitors to enjoy and be impressed by the sheer wealth of the family. Because from up here you can see the courtyard, if only I'd put the camera down. Here we go. It's substantial, it's large, there's nothing unimpressive about Raglan. But it must have been wonderful back in the day. The terraced gardens, the closest I've seen to that, although Ashby de la Zouch had water gardens and a Renaissance garden, which was very impressive before the English Civil War, is probably not in England, but in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, in the outskirts of Paris, you have the Archaeological Museum in the Old Palace, and there's terraced gardens leading down towards Paris and the Seine. And it must have been a similar effect, but with wild mountains surrounding the valley. Following this maze around the castle, we come out to the outer walkway around the moat. We've still not made it into the Great Tower, even though we've walked all the way around. You have to follow this maze to find it, and even there on the Great Tower there's a staircase that allows you to go around the outside of the Great Tower. Now sadly, the moat is in rather a sorry state, as they often are. You wouldn't exactly want to go swimming in there, and if you did find a fish, I don't think you'd want to eat it. But must have been very impressive with slightly cleaner water and less overgrowth. It's a octangular, tall, strong, foreboding tower. And you see staircases down to those arched doors onto the lake, or the moat. So you would have been able to go down to the moat, and one imagines rowing around that in this pleasure palace. Although I'm sure a lot of business was carried out here, and it was important for politics and did have some defensive worth, really this is, in its modern form, a pleasure palace, a display of wealth and opulence. But here you can see where the defences have been destroyed. Parliament didn't like it when major castles stood against Parliament, when they sided with the royalist side. After they were defeated, Parliament would vote to have them put beyond use for military use. And this often would involve months of dynamite or pulling down structures. And it left some beautiful and complete castles as ruins. The most obvious one is Corfe Castle. You go to Corfe and it looks like a bomb's gone off inside it. Buildings rent in two, split apart, but not falling, sticking at angles to each other out of the ground like shards. And this was Parliament not wanting them to return to royalist use. They dynamited the wall. Here we're underneath the bridge. You walk down a little staircase and you can walk around the outside. Really a stunning castle. If you imagine it complete, highly decorated, with water gardens and deer parks, it shows you the opulence and wealth that was the Welsh were relieved of by the Normans. The Normans and the subsequent monarchs and the nobility lived very nice and rich lives with an excess of wealth and power because of these castles. And in later years, this castle became an expression of that. Because there's a showiness. You don't have water gardens and a lake and deer park and all of that just for a bit of recreation. It's recreation to make sure everyone knows how damn powerful you are. And up at the top, beautiful view, which gives you a much better idea of the sheer scale of this castle. It's a very large castle. It's much larger than most. If you compare it, the keep of Rochester Castle is probably 3 times bigger than the Great Tower. But actually, Rochester Castle takes up much less space. Or if you compare it to other fairly major castles, like Ashby de la Zouch is probably a third of the size, a half of the size. When we go to Castle Raglan in a few weeks, that's much smaller. But this was a real maze. We walked through the whole castle, and I've probably included less than half in the video because it's just so many rooms. So as we descend the staircase to make our way out, I hope that you've enjoyed our visit to Raglan. You've got a flavour for the castle and an understanding of just how wealthy the Marcher Lords and their successors were. And I would definitely recommend coming to visit here. It's very close to Newport and Cardiff, very easy to get to, quite reasonable price to get in. was probably one of my favourite castles in southern Wales. It's very striking and elaborate, it's beautifully built, and it has such a rich history, but sadly destroyed, and deliberately destroyed, not just left to ruin. It's often underestimated the harm that the English Civil War caused to the historic buildings of Britain, because anyone who did or might stand against Parliament had their castle reduced to being unusable. And whilst it makes sense why Parliament did that, it destroyed a large piece of heritage, left many ruins that probably would still be now living or livable castle. But Raglan remains a very potent symbol of the wealth of the Marcher Lords. When the Normans came to England, they seized power, they concentrated power, and they enforced power through the castles, through the church, through the removal of any non-Norman lords that were allowed to leave on any excuse. But when they came to Wales, they gave free rein to the Marcher Lords to do pretty much whatever they want. They had license to wage war. And this left them with a wealth that they could afford to build a castle like Raglan in a magnificent gardens long lost to time. Now, I hope you'll subscribe and join me next week for another Unbound History. There's plenty more castles and Stone Age burial chambers and Norman and Roman and Saxon remains to visit. So hopefully we'll see you next week.